Welcome to another deep dive. I'm your host, and today we have a truly mind-bending topic to get into.
Yeah, I'm the resident expert here, and I can tell you the source material we are unpacking today fundamentally fractures our basic understanding of human fragility.
It really does. So to start, I want you, the listener, to put yourself in a very specific, incredibly sensory environment.
Right, like really picture this scene.
Exactly. It is the afternoon of September 13th, 1848. You are standing in the crisp late summer air in Cavendish, Vermont.
A beautiful day.
Right, but specifically, you are standing on the jagged, uneven bed of the Rutland and Burlington Railroad construction site, and it is loud.
Oh, incredibly loud.
You can hear the rhythmic, deafening strike of iron against solid rock all around you. The air tastes faintly of, like, sulfur and dirt.
Yeah, that smell of blasting powder.
Yes, and you are watching a 25-year-old construction foreman, a man entrusted with the lives of his crew, pack highly volatile blasting powder into a deep, narrow hole drilled straight into black rock.
Which is a delicate process.
Very. He is using a massive iron rod to tamp the powder down. But then there is a sudden, sharp scrape of iron against granite. A spark ignites the powder before the safety sand can even be poured in.
The buffer sand was crucial,
Right.
and it just wasn't there.
Right, so a massive explosion rips through the air. And what logic, physics, and basic human biology demand happens next is a gory, instantaneous fatality.
Absolutely.
Like, if you were standing there, you brace yourself for screaming, you brace yourself for chaos and tragedy, but instead what you get is this chilling, almost unnerving calm.
Because it's a moment that completely breaks the rules. The sheer violence of that explosion should have resulted in immediate death.
Yeah.
But the silence that follows the blast is what makes this the single most defining moment in the history of neuroscience.
Because the foreman doesn't just die.
No, he doesn't.
The explosion takes his tamping iron, which is a solid iron rod over 3 feet long, and fears it like a ballistic missile straight up.
It's just immense velocity.
It enters under his left cheekbone, plows right behind his left eye, blasts entirely through the left frontal lobe of his brain, and bursts right out through the top of his skull.
And it keeps going.
Yeah, it lands dozens of feet away, literally smeared with his blood and his brain matter. The man is thrown violently onto his back. He goes into brief convulsions, his limbs twitch. But then the man simply sits up.
Which defies every single instinct we possess about the biological machine.
Right.
When the physical structure of the brain sustains catastrophic damage like that, the system is supposed to power down. Period.
But he sits up. He actually speaks to his men.
Yeah.
And within minutes, he is sitting upright in an ox cart, riding 3/4 of a mile back to the town inn.
Fully conscious the whole way.
Fully conscious.
Yeah.
He has a hole in his head that you can literally see daylight through, and he is making grim, composed small talk with the people staring at him in absolute horror.
I mean, imagine being in that ox cart with him.
I can't even fathom it. And when the local doctor finally arrives, this man points to the bloody, shattered ruin of his own skull and says, "Doctor, here is business enough for you."
Which is arguably the most famous piece of dark humor in medical history.
It really is.
And the man making that joke is, of course, Phineas Gage, the most famous patient to ever exist in the realm of brain science.
And dissecting the reality of Phineas Gage is our entire mission for this deep dive. We are taking the source material, the original medical notes, the historical records, and the modern neurological reassessments, and we are going to explore how the single violent accident cracked open the biggest, most terrifying question in human existence.
Which is, what exactly makes you you?
Exactly. What is the self?
But to do that properly, we have to immediately address a massive tension in the historical record.
Right, the myth versus the reality.
Because the story everyone thinks they know, this neat and tidy scientific breakthrough about where the self lives, is built on a profound distortion.
A huge one.
We are going to explore not just how an iron rod through a skull taught the world that the mind is vulnerable tissue, but how the scientific establishment took a real suffering human being and retroactively turned him into a one-dimensional monster.
Just to make a complicated lesson easier to teach.
Exactly.
And in the process, they buried one of the most incredible true stories of human resilience and neurological recovery ever documented.
They really did.
We need to completely unpack this. And to understand the myth that swallowed Gage whole, we first have to grapple with the sheer, undeniable physical impossibility of his survival.
We have to look at the dirt and the physics.
Right, the dirt, the gunpowder, the reality of the railroad. Let's start with who Gage was the morning before the rock exploded. The notes emphasize that he was a highly capable construction foreman.
Yeah.
And that isn't just a job title in this context, is it?
No, it's actually a diagnostic baseline.
Hmm.
And that baseline is critical for everything that follows in his story.
So.
Well, in 1848, managing a railroad excavation crew meant you possessed a highly developed array of executive functions. You were managing a massive logistical puzzle.
Right, you've got men, explosives, schedules.
Exactly. Gage was responsible for overseeing those explosive charges, coordinating the physical labor of dozens of men, keeping strict schedules, and maintaining safety protocols in an inherently lethal environment.
Which takes a lot of mental energy.
It requires intense focus, emotional regulation, foresight, and social intelligence. The railroad contractors specifically noted that he was the most efficient and capable foreman in their employ.
So he is the guy holding the entire chaotic operation together.
He is.
Which makes the instrument of his injury even more shocking when you think about it. The sources detail this tamping iron, and we need to be very clear about what this object was.
It was not a piece of rebar.
No, not at all. It was custom made by a blacksmith specifically for Gage. It was 1.1 meters long, so just shy of 3 feet 7 inches. It was 1/4 of an inch thick at its widest point, which is roughly 3 centimeters, and it weighed 13¼ pounds.
About 6 kilograms.
Yeah.
And, to put that 13 pounds into perspective, it is roughly the weight of a standard bowling ball.
Wow.
But instead of a dense sphere, all of that mass is elongated into a rigid, tapered iron spear.
Right.
So when the blasting powder ignited prematurely, because, again, that crucial layer of sand hadn't been poured in to buffer the blast, that 13-pound spear was subjected to an immense, concentrated upward force within a narrow rock cylinder.
It basically became a cannonball.
A 13-pound cannonball fired directly at a human face.
And the anatomical trajectory of this rod is the crux of the entire medical mystery here. It doesn't just graze him.
No, it is a direct hit.
The iron enters point first, beneath his left maxilla, the cheekbone. It passes behind the left eye, completely severing the optic nerve.
Just brutal.
It violently breaches the base of the skull, drives straight upward through the left frontal lobe, and then fractures the frontal and parietal bones as it exits the top of his head.
And it takes a massive chunk of the left frontal lobe with it.
And we have to place this catastrophic trauma into its proper historical context, right? Because we are talking about rural Vermont in 1848.
Which is practically the medical dark ages compared to today.
Exactly. This is more than a decade before Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease gains any real traction.
Yeah.
It is nearly a century before the mass production of penicillin.
So in 1848, the standard medical reality was that if you punctured the skull and exposed the brain to the outside air, the patient was going to die.
It was a death sentence.
100%. Even if the initial shock and the hemorrhage didn't kill them, the inevitable bacterial infection would. I mean, the brain is an incredibly vascular, nutrient-rich environment. It is the perfect breeding ground for sepsis.
Right, because this iron rod was dragged through a dirty railroad bed.
Coated in dirt.
Coated in highly toxic blasting powder, and then shot through a man's mouth, carrying bacteria from his oral cavity directly deep into his cerebral cortex.
It is a biological nightmare.
Which makes the work of Dr. John Martin Harlow, the physician who eventually took over Gage's primary care, just an absolute marvel of 19th century medicine.
Truly, because Harlow didn't have sterile fields, he didn't have antibiotics.
So what did he do when the infection set in?
Well, when Gage inevitably developed a severe brain infection, what Harlow referred to as fungus cerebri.
Which sounds terrifying.
It is. It's essentially infected brain tissue herniating out of the skull wound.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And Harlow had to treat it mechanically. He used manual drainage, caustic applications, and just extreme vigilance.
Manual drainage of the brain.
Yeah. He actually lanced a massive abscess in Gage's brain by accessing it through his nasal cavity.
Wait, through his nose?
Yes, allowing the pus to drain out of the skull through the nasal passage.
That is incredibly grim.
It's horrible, but it worked. He essentially kept the wound open and draining, fighting off an overwhelming infection with bare-knuckle 19th century medical techniques.
It's astonishing. But, even knowing how Harlow saved him from the infection weeks later, I keep getting stuck on that immediate aftermath on the railroad tracks.
The initial survival.
Yeah. Gage is thrown on his back. He twitches, which is the central nervous system short-circuiting from a massive sudden trauma.
Right.
But then the system reboots. He sits up, And when I try to conceptualize this, the closest analogy I can find is taking a high-end computer and firing a literal bullet straight through the hard drive.
That's a great way to think about it.
You brace yourself for the catastrophic shutdown, the smoke, the dead screen. But instead, the screen flickers, the cooling fans recalibrate, and the computer simply opens a word processor and asks you what you want to type.
Exactly.
It fundamentally breaks our understanding of how a physical machine should respond to destruction.
And that analogy perfectly captures the profound bewilderment of the people standing around him that day. The brain is the ultimate biological machine.
Yeah.
It requires a delicate balance of pressure, blood flow, and electrical signaling. When a machine sustains massive structural damage, it ceases to function. Yet Gage was awake, speaking, and walking.
He was joking.
He was joking. And what the survival did, in an instant, was force the scientific and philosophical communities to confront a massive, glaring question about the dividing line between the physical body and the intangible mind.
Because if you can physically scoop out a handful of a man's brain, and the man is still awake, still reasoning, and still making grim jokes, what does that imply about the nature of human consciousness?
It's a staggering question.
I really want you, the listener, to put yourself in the boots of those railroad workers for a second. You have been raised to believe in an untouchable, eternal soul.
Right.
And then you watch a man's brain get blown out of his head, and he is still perfectly coherent. It instantly forces you to ask, is the soul completely separate from the flesh?
Is the mind just a passenger in the vehicle of the body?
Exactly. Which pulls us directly into the philosophical earthquake that followed this physical miracle. Because surviving the rod was a feat of biology. But what happened afterward changed the trajectory of human understanding forever.
It really did. And to really grasp the magnitude of this philosophical shift, we need to examine how the medical establishment viewed the brain in the 1840s.
Okay, set the stage for us.
Well, the mechanism of how biological tissue produced the conscious mind was a total void.
Nobody knew.
Nobody knew. And nature abhors a vacuum, so the scientific community had split into two deeply opposed camps.
Right.
On one side, you had phrenology, spearheaded by the followers of Franz Joseph Gall.
Now, today we recognize phrenology as a deeply flawed pseudoscience, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. But at the time, it was wildly popular. Phrenologists believed that specific mental traits like benevolence or destructiveness or acquisitiveness were localized in specific organs of the brain.
And they also believed you could read the strength of these traits by feeling the literal bumps and indentations on the outside of a person's skull.
Right, the classic parlor trick.
Yeah, like if you have a bump behind your left ear, it means you're naturally secretive.
Or if you have a pronounced ridge on your forehead, it means you're exceptionally good at geometry.
It's wild. So it was localization, but based entirely on surface anatomy.
Exactly, not actual neuroscience. Now, on the opposing side, you had the highly respected, dominant scientific view, which was equipotentiality or anti-localization.
Anti-localization.
Right. This theory, championed by figures like Jean-Pierre Flourens, argued that the cerebral cortex acted as one single unified whole.
Okay.
They fiercely resisted the idea that complex mental functions lived in isolated specific regions. In their view, the brain was basically a homogeneous battery that powered the mind.
So the whole thing just worked together to create consciousness.
Yes, and crucially, they viewed the self, the core of human character, morality, and personality as something almost ethereal.
Like a ghost inhabiting the machinery.
Exactly.
Wait, I need to stop and clarify this because it's a massive point in the source material.
Yep.
Prior to Gage, if someone suffered a stroke or took a heavy blow to the head and they lost their ability to move their left arm or they lost the ability to speak, doctors clearly understood that physical brain injury caused that physical or sensory deficit, right?
Yes, absolutely. Motor function was linked to the brain.
But losing your actual character, your ability to love, your patience, your morality, they considered that completely impossible to tie to physical brain matter.
That is the exact dividing line. The scientific consensus was perfectly comfortable linking motor function or basic sensory input to physical tissue. But your character, your manners, your self-restraint, your judgment, your very essence as a unique individual, that was considered far too elevated, too complex, and perhaps too divine to be reduced to mere biological wiring.
That is fascinating.
And in fact, the frontal lobe, where Gage was injured, was actually known at the time as the silent lobe.
The silent.
Yeah, because you could damage it and seemingly produce no immediate, obvious physical impairments like paralysis.
Wow. Which is exactly why the reports Dr. Harlow eventually published about Gage's recovery hit the scientific community like a bomb.
It shattered everything.
Because according to the historical records we have, after Gage physically healed from the infection, that highly capable, responsible foreman completely vanished.
He was gone.
In his place was a completely altered human being. Harlow wrote that Gage became fitful, irreverent, profoundly profane.
Yeah.
He was suddenly unable to stick to any plans he made, acting entirely on impulse. He was so fundamentally changed that his own friends and acquaintances looked at him and delivered that haunting assessment.
That he was no longer Gage.
No longer Gage.
Yeah.
And the railroad contractors who had previously called him their best man took one look at this impulsive, erratic new personality and outright refused to give him his job back.
And this specific behavioral shift is the foundation stone of modern neuroscience.
It really is.
Gage's case provided the very first piece of undeniable dramatic evidence suggesting that complex higher-order mental functions, specifically character, emotional regulation, and long-term planning,
Yeah.
are localized in specific places in the brain.
In this instance, the frontal lobe.
Right. It proves that the ghost in the machine wasn't a ghost at all.
The ghost is just white matter.
It is vulnerable. Physical tissue. If you destroy the tissue, you change the self. And when you strip away the clinical terminology and really sit with the implications of that, it is a deeply terrifying concept.
It really is.
Gage's survival stripped away the comforting idea of an immutable, untouchable soul. It demonstrated that human morality and social behavior have a biological mechanical basis.
I think terrifying is exactly the right word, because if you are listening to this right now, I want you to think about the things that make you, you.
Your personality.
Yeah. Your patience with your kids, your ability to restrain your temper when someone cuts you off in traffic, your work ethic, your ability to love, your sense of humor.
All of it.
We like to think of those traits as fundamental elements of our soul. But Gage's injury forces us to confront the reality that all of those deeply personal traits are literally just millimeters of brain tissue away from being utterly erased.
One bad bump.
One car accident, one stroke, and you are gone, even if your physical body keeps breathing and walking around.
And that realization fundamentally altered the trajectory of medicine. If we trace the lineage of modern neurology, every single brain scan you see today, every functional MRI that maps human fear to the amygdala or maps language production to Broca's area with a little glowing light on a computer screen is downstream of this exact moment on the railroad tracks in 1848.
Patient zero.
Phineas Gage was patient zero for the concept that complex human behavior is biologically localized.
Okay, so let's follow that logic. If Gage's personality change is the foundational stone of all modern neuroscience, if his case single-handedly shifted humanity's understanding of the soul down to biological tissue, there must be absolute mountains of data on his behavior, right?
You would certainly think so.
Yeah. I mean, I am picturing stacks of daily psychological evaluations, extensive clinical observation logs, hundreds of interviews with his friends, his family, the railroad workers.
And this is exactly where the narrative takes an incredibly startling turn.
Okay.
Because if you look at the sheer weight of the scientific paradigm built on his name, you would expect a skyscraper of empirical data. But what we actually have is a pebble.
A pebble.
The historical record regarding the actual personality change of Phineas Gage is shockingly, almost unbelievably flimsy.
How flimsy? Like, break down the actual source material for us.
Well, first off, we have virtually zero detailed first-hand accounts of Gage's personality before the accident.
Wait, really? Zero?
Practically zero.
Yeah.
We have no diaries, no letters, no standardized clinical baseline of his psychology. We only have the retrospective second-hand assertion that he was an efficient, well-balanced foreman.
Okay, but what about after the accident? There has to be data on the change.
Regarding the famous massive personality change after the accident, the entire towering edifice of medical consensus, this idea that he became an unrecognizable, impulsive wreck, rests on roughly 300 words.
300 words?
Yes.
That is less than a single page in a paperback novel. It's the length of a slightly rambling email. You are telling me the foundation of frontal lobe neuroscience is 300 words long.
It is a microscopic sliver of evidence. And the timing makes it even more vulnerable.
What do you mean?
Those 300 words describing his personality change were written by Dr. Harlow in a report published in 1868.
Okay.
That is 20 years after the accident.
Oh, wow.
And crucially, it was written several years after Phineas Gage was already dead.
Mhm.
Harlow hadn't even seen or treated Gage for years when he wrote those words.
I read that in the source notes, and I literally had to read it twice to make sure I understood it. The foundational text of modern neuroscience is a single rural doctor writing largely from memory 2 decades after the fact about a guy who had already passed away. That is a wild scientific standard. It is the equivalent of trying to define a human being's entire life, their inner soul, their character, and their enduring historical legacy, based entirely on a single, blurry, out-of-focus photograph taken by an acquaintance 20 years ago.
It really is.
It is an incredibly fragile foundation for the immense, paradigm-shifting weight placed upon it.
And it forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about the vulnerability of the scientific record itself.
Yeah.
How does an entire branch of medical science anchor itself to such a shockingly thin foundation?
So how did it?
The answer lies in the profound tension between historical truth and medical utility. You have to understand that Harlow's 1868 report was never intended to be a comprehensive modern psychological evaluation.
Right, he was just a country doctor.
Exactly. It was a brief anecdotal recollection presented to the Massachusetts Medical Society. But in the 1860s, scientists like Paul Broca were just beginning to prove that speech was localized in a specific part of the brain.
Ah.
The medical community was suddenly desperate for historical case studies that proved localization of higher functions. They needed an anchor.
They needed proof.
They needed a clear, dramatic example to point to that illustrated frontal lobe function to defeat the equipotentiality camp. Gage's story was intensely dramatic and incredibly convenient.
So they grabbed it.
So those 300 words were seized upon, amplified, and permanently canonized.
And when a foundation is that thin, when the actual historical data is that sparse, it leaves a massive, gaping vacuum.
Now, we all know what fills a vacuum in history.
Human bias.
Always.
Because no one really had a thick, verified file on the real, complex Phineas Gage. Later generations of scientists, textbook authors, and lecturers had an incredible amount of empty space to project whatever narrative they wanted onto him.
Yes, they did.
We transition from a sparse, messy, poorly documented truth into a vastly inflated, monstrous myth. So, how did the medical textbooks distort Gage over the following century?
They systematically turned him into a grotesque caricature.
How bad was it?
Over the decades following his death, scientific textbooks, popular medical literature, and university lectures took Harlow's brief mention that Gage was profane and fitful and aggressively wildly inflated it.
Right.
Textbooks began inventing details out of thin air. They claimed Gage became a violent, drunken brawler.
Which wasn't in Harlow's notes.
Not at all. They claimed he was a sexual deviant, a vagrant, a chronic liar, a man completely incapable of empathy. They transformed him into a textbook psychopath.
The source documents explicitly state that surveys of scientific literature show the vast, overwhelming majority of modern descriptions paint this dramatic, permanent psychopathy-like change.
It's everywhere.
They essentially turned a traumatized railroad worker into a comic book supervillain, and they completely, utterly ignored any possibility of recovery.
Exactly. They erased any nuance and locked him into a state of permanent, violent degradation.
It's awful.
And what is truly fascinating and deeply troubling from an ethical standpoint is why the medical community actively chose to do this.
Yeah. Why systematically exaggerate the symptoms of a real historical patient?
Because a permanently ruined monster is a phenomenally clean, easy-to-teach cautionary tale.
That makes so much sense, unfortunately.
Think about it from the perspective of a medical professor. If you are standing in front of a lecture hall full of overwhelmed, sleep-deprived med students, and you need to teach them about the function of the prefrontal cortex, it is incredibly efficient to say, the frontal lobe controls your humanity. Look at Phineas Gage. He damaged it, and he turned into an absolute monster forever.
Right. It's much, much harder to stand up there and say, well, frontal lobe damage causes a highly complex nonlinear array of behavioral shifts that may or may not abate over time depending on environmental structures, social scaffolding, and neuroplasticity.
Exactly. The monster is just a better, stickier teaching tool.
It highlights the extreme danger of a clean narrative in science.
It really does.
The scientific community, an institution that stakes its entire reputation on empirical rigor and objective data, essentially allowed a myth to propagate and even actively embellished it because it was pedagogically useful.
And we have to recognize that this is not just an abstract historical critique about 19th century medical ethics.
No, it has modern implications.
There are incredibly severe real-world costs to this myth happening right now. Modern critics, neuroscientists, and rehabilitation specialists have aggressively pointed out that this brain damage equals permanent monster narrative has actively and toxically shaped how society treats people.
Even segments of the medical field.
Right. It shapes how they treat living, breathing brain injuries survivors today.
This is exactly where I get so incredibly indignant on Gage's behalf. It actually makes me
This is
furious.
completely understandable.
You have these brilliant, highly educated scientific minds essentially writing fan fiction about a real suffering human being just because the complex truth was too messy for a clean textbook chapter. And the collateral damage of that fiction is that today, right now, patients dealing with traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, are unjustly cast by society as irretrievably broken, fundamentally dangerous, or permanently lost.
It's a heavy burden.
We took the stigma we retroactively invented for a man in 1848, and we are continuously pasting it on to people fighting through recovery in neurology wards right now.
It is a terrible, tragic irony. In their desperate attempt to understand the biological basis of human nature, the scientific narrative actively stripped Phineas Gage of his own humanity.
They really did.
And we need to exercise extreme caution here, as you rightly point out. We should never be armchair diagnosing a man who's been dead for over 165 years with highly loaded modern psychiatric terms like psychopath.
Yep, definitely not.
Harlow never used that word. None of his contemporaries used that word. It is medically irresponsible, it is historically entirely inaccurate, and it does a massive disservice to the reality of his injury.
Absolutely no armchair diagnosing.
Yeah.
We have to strip away the textbook myth and look exclusively at what the actual historical record says.
Right.
And the textbook monster myth always ends the exact same way. With Gage as a ruined man, drifting aimlessly, dying destitute in the gutter, completely incapable of caring for himself or contributing to society.
That's the myth.
But the reality is that Gage didn't just disappear into a textbook footnote. The man kept living.
He had a whole second act.
He had a life after the trauma. And this brings us to the most incredible, deliberately buried truth of his later life: the Chilean stagecoach.
The historical evidence that the legend actively ignores and suppresses points toward a genuinely remarkable arc of resilience and recovery.
Okay, walk us through it.
After the worst of his initial injury, and after the immediate chaotic behavioral aftermath described by Dr. Harlow, Gage didn't just lay down and give up. He found work.
Doing what?
Initially, he worked at a livery stable in New Hampshire, caring for horses. He spent some time exhibiting himself, not as a freak show attraction, as some myths claim, but simply displaying his tamping iron at places like Barnum's Museum in New York.
Which was a pretty common way to earn a living if you had a unique story back then.
Exactly. But eventually, the trajectory of his life took an astonishing turn. He traveled to South America,
Wow.
and he spent years working as a long-haul stagecoach driver in Chile, running the route between Valparaiso and Santiago.
I really want us to stop and critically examine that detail because it shatters the entire myth.
It completely dismantles it.
He was a stagecoach driver in Chile in the mid-19th century. Driving a stagecoach is not like sitting in the passenger seat of an automatic sedan on a freshly paved interstate.
Not at all.
Think about the physical and cognitive load of that job. I am picturing a man holding the reins of a team of up to 6 massive, powerful horses.
Right.
He is navigating deeply treacherous, unpaved, mountainous routes in a foreign country. This specific job demanded intense, flawless route memory.
It demanded strict adherence to complex scheduling
Incredibly steady nerves.
and constant high-stakes diplomatic interaction with both his teams of horses and his paying passengers.
Which is huge. From a purely neurological perspective, that job requires an immense sustained amount of what we call executive function.
Exactly. The exact type of higher-order cognitive processing that takes place in the prefrontal cortex.
A part he damaged.
Right. To successfully drive a multi-horse stagecoach over mountain passes, you have to constantly anticipate environmental problems. You have to rapidly regulate your emotions and physical reactions when a horse spooks or a wheel slips.
You can't just lose your temper.
No, you must maintain hypervigilant focus for hours on end and adapt instantly to sudden chaotic changes.
The analogy that comes to mind is being an air traffic controller while simultaneously running a marathon.
That is a perfect description.
You are physically battered and exhausted by the elements, but your brain has to be firing on all cylinders, constantly calculating variables, just to keep the entire operation from crashing off a cliff.
Yeah.
You fundamentally cannot do that job if you are a violent, impulsive, uncontrollable wreck who can't stick to a basic plan. It is a biological impossibility.
It just doesn't work.
That is simply not the resume of a permanently broken monster. It is the resume of a man who quietly, painstakingly, and brilliantly rebuilt his own mind.
And this hidden reality brings us to the modern reassessments of Gage's life, which have been truly groundbreaking in restoring his humanity.
Let's talk about those reassessments.
Well, researchers like the Australian psychologist Malcolm McMillan dedicated immense time and effort to painstakingly reconstructing the actual verified timeline of Gage's life.
Stripping away the decades of myth.
Systematically. And in 1994, renowned neuroscientists Hannah and Antonio Damasio, along with a team of researchers, took this reassessment a massive step forward.
What did they do?
They actually modeled Gage's specific injury digitally. They used highly detailed imaging of his actual skull, which is preserved in a museum, to map the precise trajectory of the iron rod through standard brain space using early 3D modeling techniques.
And what did that 1994 digital model actually reveal when they finally looked at the hard biological data instead of the 19th century folklore?
The digital modeling revealed something extraordinary. It showed that while the left frontal lobe was severely damaged, the right hemisphere of his brain was entirely spared.
The entire right side was fine.
Yes, the motor cortices were spared. And crucially, it highlighted a profound story of neuroplasticity.
Which is a biological concept that didn't even exist in the scientific vocabulary of 1848.
Exactly. The brain does not function merely as a series of isolated rigid boxes. It works in incredibly complex, overlapping, dynamic networks.
Right.
When a specific region is destroyed, the brain possesses an astonishing inherent capacity to adapt, to reroute its signaling, and to compensate for the missing tissue.
That is amazing.
The severe behavioral deficits that Gage undoubtedly experienced in those first chaotic months and years likely eased significantly over time as his brain rewired itself.
Because of his environment, right?
Yeah. The highly structured environment of working closely with horses and the immense, repetitive cognitive demands of driving the stagecoach likely acted as a form of intense organic occupational therapy.
He essentially rehabbed his own brain on the dusty, high-altitude roads of Chile.
He did.
He forced his surviving neural pathways to take over the functions of the missing tissue through sheer, repeated effort.
It's an incredible testament to human endurance.
It really is. But I know we need to be very careful here as we rewrite this narrative. We cannot swing the historical pendulum too far in the opposite direction and accidentally write a new, overly sanitized, perfect story of recovery.
That is a vital scientific and historical caveat. We absolutely cannot overcorrect and suddenly claim that Phineas Gage was perfectly fine or that his neurological recovery was 100% complete.
Because we just don't know.
Right. The historical evidence is simply too thin on both sides of the debate to make absolute, definitive claims about his inner life. He suffered a massive, catastrophic brain trauma. He lost a significant volume of prefrontal tissue. He undoubtedly carried profound scars, both physical and behavioral, for the rest of his life. He likely still had moments of impulsivity or frustration that he wouldn't have had prior to the blast.
Sure.
But while the evidence is sparse, the verified timeline of his employment heavily points toward a substantial, socially meaningful recovery.
He didn't die a monster.
No. He regained his dignity, his autonomy, and his ability to function as a highly capable member of society.
He found a way to live with a literal hole in his head and a massive chunk of his frontal lobe missing. He adapted. He survived.
He truly did.
So how does this incredible, messy, remarkably resilient life actually come to an end?
After roughly 7 years of driving the stagecoach in Chile, his physical health finally began to deteriorate.
7 years of that job.
Yeah, and the harsh conditions likely took a toll. He eventually left South America and returned to the United States to be cared for by his mother and family, who had relocated to the area around San Francisco. In 1860, though a few historical sources suggest 1861, about 12 years after the tamping iron tore through his skull on that railroad bed, Phineas Gage passed away.
12 years later, what was the cause?
The cause of death was a series of severe, compounding epileptic seizures, a condition known as status epilepticus.
Oh, wow.
These seizures were almost certainly a delayed long-term consequence of the massive physical trauma and scarring on his brain.
So he survives the fundamentally impossible. He lives another 12 demanding years. He successfully rebuilds his cognitive life in a foreign country, and then the physical reality of the original wound finally catches up with him.
Yes, exactly.
But his physical presence, his role in the scientific narrative, didn't end in the ground in San Francisco, did it?
No, it didn't.
Yeah.
Several years after Gage died, Dr. Harlow, the physician who originally treated him and who wanted to finally write a comprehensive medical paper on the case, tracked down Gage's family.
Wow, okay.
Harlow actually requested permission to physically examine Gage's skull to study the precise nature of the bony injury scientifically.
And they let him.
Remarkably, Gage's family consented to this. His body was exhumed, and the skull, along with the tamping iron which had been buried with him, were sent to Harlow.
That is wild.
And today, if you travel to Harvard University's Warren Anatomical Museum, you can walk right up to them.
They're just there.
They sit quietly inside a glass display case. The skull of Phineas Gage, bearing its massive, jagged, fully healed exit wound, resting right next to the 13-pound iron rod that created it.
That is profound.
They remain two of the most famous, most fiercely debated, and most heavily examined relics in the entire history of modern medicine.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive into the source material and to the profound double echo of this man's story.
It really is a double echo.
Because Phineas Gage leaves us with two incredibly distinct legacies. First, there is the scientific echo. He was the man who definitively proved that the self is inextricably tied to physical tissue.
He taught humanity where the soul lives.
But it is vital to remember that he never volunteered for that job. He was just a 25-year-old guy trying to clear some black rock on a Wednesday afternoon, and he caught a bad spark.
And then there's the human echo, which, when you really look at the history, is arguably the more profound and challenging legacy.
Absolutely.
The scientific establishment took a real person, a man who suffered unimaginable trauma and fought his way back to functionality, and they systematically stripped him of his humanity.
They ignored his incredible resilience.
They completely erased his demanding, triumphant years in Chile.
They kept only the broken, impulsive parts of him that were useful for a clean textbook lesson, and they casually discarded the rest of his life.
We actively turned him into a monster simply because monsters make for easier homework assignments.
I want you, listening to this right now, to really think about those two silent objects sitting in that glass case at Harvard. We have spent well over a century staring intently at the wound, utterly fascinated by the jagged hole the iron rod left behind.
Staring at the damage.
But in our relentless clinical obsession with the damage, we completely forgot to look at the man who healed around it. And it leaves you with a deeply unsettling question to carry with you. What other monsters or cautionary tales in our history books or even in our hospitals today are really just ordinary people whose incredible resilience was simply too messy for a clean story?